In our previous chapter, we followed the rancid stench seeping from the chronic wounds of King Henry VIII, a monarch who devoured his own flesh in solitude, betrayal, and rot. But Henry was merely a threshold. Behind him lies an entire graveyard of thrones, where bodies decayed not on the battlefield, but in endless chambers of lust. Now, we descend deeper into the tunnel of history's darker corridors, where syphilis was not just a disease, but a symbol of dynastic decay. No crown was immune, no royal blood left untainted. From Portugal to Persia, from London to Vienna, syphilis crept behind velvet curtains, passed through whispered kisses, then exploded into madness, infertility, and dynastic ruin. In this episode, we uncover 5 royal ghosts, rulers who spread the plague, received it, and died with it. It wasn't death of the body that made them tragic. It was the silent death, the unraveling of their minds beneath rotting silks and moaning bedchambers, where power could no longer disguise disease. 1. King Louis I of Portugal, 1838 to 1889, the Shakespeare scholar devoured by flesh. Some kings are born to rule. Others are thrown onto the throne like a cruel joke from fate. Louis IV was the latter. Born the second son, Louis was never meant to wear a crown. His life was set to be one of velvet-lined leisure. A royal scholar, a quiet prince translating Shakespeare into Portuguese, as though decoding the very tragedy of his own bloodline. Handsome, multilingual, and dangerously charming, he was Lisbon's favorite heartbreaker, a playboy prince with a poet's tongue and a trail of broken hearts behind him. But in 1861, death crept into the palace like a silent ghost. A mysterious illness, possibly typhoid, took 3 of Louis's brothers, including young King Pedro Fep. In a matter of weeks, the poet prince became an accidental monarch. The Braganza dynasty was now in crisis, and it needed heirs, fast. Louis began wife hunting, as though the monarchy itself was a patient in need of urgent treatment. After a few failed matches, he married Maria Pia of Italy, a 14-year-old princess described as a little angel in a golden cage. The couple quickly produced 2 sons, a promising start to a royal marriage. But behind the silk curtains, the story unraveled. Louis had never stopped seeking pleasure beyond the marriage bed. The queen's perfumes could not mask the scent of other women's powder, especially that of Rosa de Lima, a famous actress, and the king's longtime mistress. Heartbroken and humiliated, Maria Pia began taking suspiciously long journeys abroad, and court whispers suggest she may have found her own ways to even the score. Amid this tangled web of royal affairs, syphilis slipped in like a curse. At first, it slept, but by 1887 it awakened with a vengeance. And this time, it struck the king's mind. Louis had developed neurosyphilis, the disease's most cruel form. The scholar king began to forget his own words. He suffered emotional outbursts, seizures, and delusions. During formal audiences, he was said to cry without reason, once claiming he heard voices in the walls. The man who once adored Hamlet now lived inside his own Shakespearean tragedy, rotten from within, unraveling in paranoia and solitude. He died in 1889, at just 50 years old. Not from war, not from betrayal, but from a wound no one could see, festering beneath red velvet and golden embroidery. Whispers from the royal crypt. Shakespeare wrote, "That which is rotten shall fall." But Louis Scyther didn't fall by fate. He decayed slowly, undone by the very pleasures he could never resist. 2. Shah Abbas II of Persia, 1632 to 1666, the drunken ruler of a dying harem. From battlefield to banquet hall, kings have met their ends in many ways. Abbas II may have done both, but his true killer was a lesion no one saw coming. We leave behind the moldy libraries of Portugal and step into the incense-scented palaces of Safavid Persia, a land once radiant with imperial glory, yet riddled beneath the silk with a darkness that crept straight into the royal bloodstream. Abbas II ascended the throne at just 9 years old, a pearl set in the Safavid crown, but his boyish face already carried the gleam of ambition. By 15, he had banished his father's grand vizier and seized the empire like a man gulping down the first wine of a feast not yet begun. He was clever, strategic, and bold, avoiding war with the Ottomans, defeating the Mughals, pushing back the Russians. Under Abbas, Persia knew peace, but peace is often the lull that tempts ruin. Soon, Abbas II was drowning in strong wine, hollow music, and endless nights of velvet-clad pleasure. He famously drank from a golden goblet encrusted with rubies, a gift from the Russian Tsar. But no jewel could fill the void in a ruler who never learned restraint. His harem was a prison of silk, crowded with enslaved women seized from conquered lands, each one a trophy, a toy, and unknowingly, a vessel for the illness brewing beneath the king's skin. No one can say exactly when syphilis began to gnaw at Abbas, but by 1666, the signs could no longer be ignored. At just 34 years old, his body was falling apart like an abandoned palace. Clouded eyes, blotched skin, a mind slowly slipping into fog. Whispers spread. The harem, too, was becoming infected. A silent epidemic, passed from throne to bedsheet. There were no more councils, no more commands, just long, strange feasts, echoing in empty halls, fueled by delusion and pain. And then, the music stopped. Abbas II died young, not as a warrior, not as a builder of empires, but as a shadow of his former self, leaving behind a court already hollowing from within. Whisper from the bottom of the cup. The ancient Persians believed illness was punishment from the heavens. If so, syphilis did not just kill Abbas. It judged a dynasty that turned flesh into power and women into war spoils. Third crown. Prince Rudolf of Austria, 1858 to 1889, heir to madness, disease, and dynasty. We now leave Persia behind and cross the mist-veiled forests of Central Europe, where the sound of hooves has long faded. But inside the stone walls of Meyerling, the weeping never stopped. Not for war, but for a tragedy of sex, sickness, and shattered sanity, the undoing of a dynasty from within. They say great empires don't fall overnight, but the House of Habsburg very nearly did, when the heart of its heir had already begun to rot in the womb. Crown Prince Rudolf, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth, the fabled Sisi, was born burdened with the full weight of a centuries-old empire. But at just 6 years old, he was torn from his mother and placed under the care of a notoriously cruel tutor. Beaten, isolated, molded into a political instrument, he grew up with wounds no blade could cause, but that festered all the same. As an adult, Rudolf was intelligent, sharp-witted, and deeply unstable. He drank heavily, chased danger like an addict, and questioned everything his father's empire stood for. He moved through Vienna like a falling star, bright, doomed and constantly trailing smoke. At 23, he married Princess Stephanie of Belgium, who was only 17 at the time. But even during their introduction, Rudolf brought along his current mistress, as if to remind everyone that the wedding was a political formality, not a vow of fidelity. After their daughter was born, Rudolf grew cold, cruel, and then came the catastrophe. He contracted both gonorrhea and syphilis, and without hesitation, passed the infection to his wife. Stephanie's fallopian tubes were destroyed. She would never bear another child. The doctors called it a stomach illness. She knew better, and she never forgave him. What followed was a slow unraveling. Rejected in the bedroom, pushed aside in politics, and haunted by his own failures, Rudolf spiraled. Stephanie loved another. He begged one mistress to die with him. She refused. So he turned to another. Baroness Mary Vetsera, just 17 years old, enchanted by his melancholy and royal despair. On January 30th, 1889, their bodies were found inside the hunting lodge at Mayerling. Mary had been shot in the head. Rudolf took his own life hours later. Her corpse was propped up in a carriage using a broomstick, then buried hastily in a pauper's grave. The court told the world he died of a brain aneurysm. But all of Vienna knew the truth. Syphilis, depression, betrayal. This was not just the death of a prince, it was the death of a future, and of an empire's illusion of control. Whisper in the halls of Mayerling. Rudolf didn't die for love. He died for the truth, that neither love nor empire could save a mind poisoned in childhood and a body ravaged by careless desire. 4. John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, 1647–1680, the decadent poet, rotting genius. From the frozen halls of Mayerling, we now stumble into the Restoration Court of England, where wine spilled like blood, poetry seduced more than prayer, and a young earl named John Wilmot set himself ablaze in the fires of lust and satire. Some men spread disease by accident. John Wilmot did it as a lifestyle. Between bursts of laughter, filthy verses, and overflowing goblets, he passed on his afflictions like love letters written in venom. Born into the gilded afterglow of England's restored monarchy, Wilmot was raised under the patronage of King Charles II, a war hero's son taken in as a royal favorite. The king thought he was nurturing a loyal noble. He was, in fact, cultivating his own poetic assassin. By 13, Wilmot was at Oxford. By 17, touring Europe. By 20, kidnapping the woman he intended to marry, only to land in the Tower of London. He later redeemed himself by fighting in the Second Dutch War, returned a war hero, won back Elizabeth Malle, and forgot her the moment he was back in London's brothels. He quickly rose to lead the infamous Merry Gang, a crew of libertine aristocrats who lived for drink, flesh, and midnight scandals. Wilmot bedded actress Nell Gwynn, who later became the king's own mistress. He mentored and impregnated Elizabeth Barry, the great tragic actress of the era, then abandoned her when her fame eclipsed his own. Between these escapades, he wrote poetry that sliced like a dagger, witty, obscene, and mercilessly aimed at court hypocrisy. Once, he mocked the king's sexual obsessions in a public performance. He was banished. Naturally. Wilmot responded by reinventing himself as Dr. Bendo, a quack fertility doctor who roamed London with potions and promises. Sometimes he disguised himself as Madame Bendo, allowing him to examine young women privately. Many of them left pregnant, not from medicine, but from the doctor himself. But syphilis requires no weapons, only time. By age 33, the charming rake was unrecognizable. Blind, nose disintegrated, body collapsing, mind slipping between rhyme and delirium. He died in 1680, surrounded not by lovers or friends, but by the ghost of who he once was. A rotting remnant of his own brilliance, a prince of pleasure, buried in silence, whisper from his final tavern. Wilmot lived each day as if it were the last night on earth, and died as if death was one final joke. But syphilis doesn't laugh. It waits, and then it collects, one piece of flesh at a time.
5. Emperor Joseph, the First of Habsburg, 1678-1711. The man who infected his wife and buried his bloodline. We've now reached the final act in this theater of flesh and rot, where it's no longer just a man decaying, but an entire dynasty unraveling along the infected wound of a careless young emperor who ruled more with his loins than with his crown. The Habsburgs once stood atop Europe, but a single lesion in the trousers of Joseph I was enough to puncture the illusion of eternal empire. Joseph, firstborn son of Emperor Leopold I, was raised among velvet drapes, church music, and the iron belief that his blood was the lifeblood of the Holy Roman Empire. He grew up clever, charismatic, and above all, dangerously indulgent. From his teenage years, Joseph collected women like taxes. His wild hunts didn't just target deer. They also included young village girls delivered by his loyal procurer, Count Lemberg. When he finally married, it was to Wilhelmina Amalia, a devout and dignified princess who underwent thorough medical testing before the wedding, like a broodmare, not a bride. Unsurprisingly, Joseph grew bored quickly. He publicly appointed Countess Marianne Palffy as his official mistress, a scandal unheard of in the conservative Habsburg court. The Pope was outraged. His mother screamed. The court whispered. Joseph? He laughed and poured more wine. But tragedy was already fermenting beneath that laughter. One day, Joseph contracted syphilis, likely from the gardener's daughter, a fitting insult from the very earth he ruled. Instead of isolating, he continued sleeping with his wife, without warning, without remorse, without even medicine. Soon, Wilhelmina's hair began to fall out. Her skin broke open. She became infertile. And yet, in her innocent piety, she believed it was punishment for hidden sins. She prayed, not for healing, but for a son. She never knew that her husband was the curse. They did have one son, Leopold Joseph, but he died in infancy, very likely marked by congenital syphilis. And with that, the future of the Habsburgs died in the cradle. Joseph's brother, Charles VI, took the throne, but could produce only daughters. Desperate, Charles forced his wife Elizabeth to drink strong liquor and stare at paintings of naked men, believing it would arouse her enough to conceive a boy. The result? She became obese, alcoholic, and gave birth to girls, and only girls. Joseph died at age 32 after a reign of chaos, carnality, and failure. On his deathbed, he swore to Wilhelmina that if he survived, he would finally be faithful. He never had to keep that promise. Syphilis closed the curtain for him. Whisper from the coffin of empire. They said Joseph was an emperor who never lost a battle, but he lost to himself and left behind a bloodline rotting all the way down to its final daughters. A sin no bigger than a pinprick, but sharp enough to pierce history itself. So, we followed Syphilis across 5 thrones, each legion a confession no royal historian dared to write. But don't think it was Syphilis alone that ate away the crown. Some royals needed no disease to go mad, only power. Some children were damned from birth, simply for the blood in their veins. In the episodes to come, we'll descend further into royal madness with noble names, into wounds that never bore heirs, and into the stone crypts where blue-blooded secrets were buried alive. Royal blood may run deep, but it is never clean. If you're not afraid of the throne yet, you haven't truly heard the wind that howls through the old halls of Versailles, or the broken laughter of the mad kings of Spain. Subscribe and join me as we unseal more locked chambers, where history stays silent, but the corpses do not. This is Dirty Royal Secrets, and the rot beneath the marble has only just begun to stir. See you in the next tale, where a queen smiles in her dungeon, and a child with 3 fathers claws his way to the crown.